I proceeded to ingest the cola. I gave up caffeine nearly 2 years ago. I also gave up most soda pop, caffeinated or not, because it contains corn syrup. I don't know exactly why corn syrup is worse for you than regular syrup, but I do know I don't need the extra calories. However, when Skidrick, the Fossinol, offered me a cola brewed and bottled with his own furry paws, I had to accept. First of all, I was parched, as we say in the kooky South, from my long trek to Skidrick's doorstep across the arid plain, and second, I wanted to do nothing to offend this unusual creature. I only hoped that I wouldn't renew my addiction to caffeine. Skidrick, being a Fossinol, was about 8 feet tall. He had no neck. His enormous head began just above his sternum and extended far above his shoulders. 2 long ears stood up on top of this head. He was completely covered with golden brown fur, the texture and appearance of shag carpeting. Despite this, he was not a nudist. Few Fossinols are. He wore a loose-fitting pair of sky-blue coveralls. His boots, which he didn't wear indoors, were against the wall under a photograph of some monument of special significance within Fossinol culture. His face, though covered with slightly shorter fur than the rest of his body, yet looked surprisingly like that of Paul Newman, though with a nose similar to that of a proboscis monkey. "I hope you like it," Skidrick said as he handed me the bottle. "I'm so thirsty," I equivocated, noting the homemade label pasted on the bottle. I pried the top off with a small tool from my kit and took an experimental sip. "Tasty," I admitted, before downing the rest of it. "Do you want another?" Skidrick asked. "No, I'd better not." I shook my head, already worried about the onset of the drug's effects. "Okay, what did you want to see me about?" Skidrick sat on the one side of his kitchen table, I on the opposite. I hesitated, holding up a shaky hand before my eyes. "What's wrong?" Skidrick asked. "Do you want a glass of water?" "You have water?" I demanded insanely. 6 major statements of the Tractor Man. The Tractor Man, dread sovereign of the small coastal region adjacent to Millie's backyard, is remembered for his so-called major statements, 6 of which we will explore in the coming weeks. His minor statements, a collection of offhand remarks unintended for preservation, are not covered in this course. Why only 6 of the approximately 50 major statements? The answer to this question, gentlemen, is that we simply don't have time to cover them all. We will barely have time to explore adequately the 6 chosen statements before you have to get ready for your comprehensive examinations in your chosen fields. The 6 statements that have been selected for this course are generally considered the most important and, as the Tractor Man is a relatively minor figure in the overall history of the Flotcha Major, therefore about as much as you are ever likely to need to know on the whole subject. Now, it is important before we begin that you understand something of the circumstances in which the major statements were uttered. We know from the Analects of Grissom that the Tractor Man did intend these statements for posterity. He therefore put a lot of thought into them, and they represent a crystallization of his vision. Some have theorized that because the statements were only written down and collected for publication after the Tractor Man's death at the hands of Captain Plow, that somehow the opposite is the case. But remember the Tractor Man's first statement, "I am the Tractor Man." This is a classic example of the primacy of identity, clearly showing the Tractor Man's self-awareness as a public figure. He knew his place in society. He knew the value that he placed on his words and the value that would be placed on them by successors to his office. In general, each statement was made while the Tractor Man was in full costume, a thick plume of smoke emerging from his exhaust pipe headpiece. He would stand before the Council of Delegation and make his statements in a deep, superhero-type voice, while symbolic word balloons made of painted sailcloth, stiffened with rosin, and outlined in rich charcoal, were carried about the chamber by young apprentices. The members of the Council of Delegation, each a fully licensed attorney or mechanic, would applaud the statement, either out of fear for their lives or out of genuine appreciation. The others must be punished. Skilled artisans employed by the Commission to recreate the Big Kitchen's original decor found themselves stumped. Only Waglin Mulk, the janitor, saw a way through. "Clearly, these are photographs of exterior structures," he explained, pointing at the lithographic depictions of the Big Kitchen, as it was during the height of its glory during the reign of King Cheesemuff. not abstract paintings. How did he, a mere janitor, know that? Francis, admitting the truth of Mulk's insight, whispered to his colleague Jerome. Well, he is also an author, Jerome pointed out. Yes, Francis expostulated disgustedly, of self-published nonsense. Nevertheless, Mulk's suggestion was accepted, that the framed pictures over the vegetable cutting counter were supposed to be photographs of structures. But what structures? Where were they to be found? Did they even still exist? Stop asking me so many questions, Dink Harbigood, the commission's liaison with the project, begged. Well, what are we going to do then? Mosett Rand interlaced his fingers and dropped his hands before his crotch. We'll get Strassman to handle it, Harbigood decided. Strassman, Rand repeated, but you said yourself he's a loose cannon. He's the only man for a job like this, Harbigood picked up the phone on his desk. Marcia, get me Marvin Strassman. So it was that Strassman, called by some the most capable man in the universe, by others the most unstable, was assigned the task of locating the structures in the old photographs and rephotographing them. Try to reproduce the original photographs as much as possible, Harbigood ordered. The angles, the lighting, so forth. But if you can't, just an approximation will do. The others must be punished, Strassman growled as he picked his teeth with the edge of a business card from his brother-in-law's lumber emporium. What's that? Harbigood snapped. What others? The ones that say I'm unstable. The most unstable man in the universe, he quoted with a dog-like, rasping laugh. He glanced at the business card. That's my price, Harbigood. Legacies of Sweet Citrus. It was a mark of Skidrick's respect for Strassman that he offered to share with him some of the citrus fruit from the basket he had been sent by Flagram's lumber emporium. No, thanks, Strassman replied. He dropped onto the sofa and massaged the recently scabbed-over wound on the back of his left hand. Danger was part of the overhead in his business, he reflected with grim, self-deprecating humor. Personally, Skidrick said, grabbing a fat grapefruit, I can't get enough of this stuff. You know, the working-class Fastenal chuckled wistfully. I still remember the first orange I ever ate. Really? Strassman smiled the smile of one who knows the pleasures of reminiscence. How did it come about? I was working in a small photography shop in old Camden Town. Skidrick cast his mind back over the decades. He leaned back in his custom-built lazy boy, but did not throw the footrest up. That would have been too casual. One day the old man who owned the place came back from visiting the drugstore next door. He had a candy bar and a can of pineapple juice. I can't remember the name of the candy bar, but it was one I'd never tried before. I know that. Mr. Wagon Wheel, that was his name, saw me looking at the candy bar. Have you ever had a hornet's nest bar, or whatever it was called? He asked. I said no, and he held it out to me with his hand covering almost the whole thing. Go on, break off a piece, he said. Well, the way he was holding the candy bar, I couldn't do anything more than smudge up a little dusting of crumbs. I dropped them in my mouth and told him it was good, even though I could hardly get a good taste out of it. Then he asked me if I'd ever had pineapple juice. I said no, so he got out a plastic cup and poured me a couple of swallows. I drank it, and later that day, after I'd gotten off work, I got thinking about what else in the world I'd never tried, and realized I'd never tried an orange. So I went to the grocery store and bought one and ate it. It was okay, but it took me years to find out I preferred grapefruit. His eyes were on the ceiling when he ceased talking. I'll never eat an orange again, Strassman's voice was as soft as a smothering pillow. They remind me of the sun. The Danish have an instinctual feeling for these things. My time in Copenhagen was marked by an almost indefinable sadness. I say almost indefinable because, while I, in the English tongue, am without adequate means to describe the way I felt, I found that the Danish concept of hakmakken perfectly encapsulates this kind of sadness. A couple of my associates on the Wheel of Pain wanted to know what I had been so sad about. If I knew that, I told them, I might have been able to put it into words. I laughed, but they did not. So great was their supposed concern. Well, Donna began thoughtfully, what does this hakmakken mean? The exact translations are hard to come by, I warned. However, the closest thing I can think of is the kind of feeling you get when you realize that the times when you embarrassed yourself don't bother you nearly as much as the times you remember when you embarrassed or hurt the feelings of someone else. Well, that sounds like a pretty good definition, Donna protested. They're always looking for a way to trap me. They think I'm some kind of plaything. Yes, but that's still not exactly it. I waggled my hands. You know, they say ancient Greek was a very precise language, But of course Greek isn't another word for pastry, and so the gathering broke up into its constituent elements, each to debate and discuss the issues raised during our time together. My dependents and I hunkered in a corner behind a crate labeled machine parts and hoped that the wind wouldn't shift direction. "I've got a secret," I confided to them. "What is it?" one of the little quasi-people I carry about with me asked eagerly. "I've never been to Denmark per se," I teased, "but I do have a couple of bear claws with me." I smiled broadly, reached into a pocket, and brought forth the treats. "You don't stay sad for long, do you?" another of my little friends commented as he took his share of the offering. "Never," I insisted. "Not when I can get away from that ignorant crowd." I watched them eat for a few minutes. What delightful creatures! Dressed in their colorful knitted outfits, and each possessed of a plethora of tentacles, they amused and ennobled me. As well they should, for I had invented them myself. Greedy bastards left me nothing. Comparison of itch relief to correction fluid. The following comparison, a classic of its kind, has been made before, most notably by the Duc de Dingle in his second volume of War Correspondence. However, I feel that my expostulation of the comparison is superior to his and to those of its other acclaimed delineators, if for no other reason than its having the unique quality of being made by me. But judge for yourselves, you intense devotees of distinction. "Itch relief," said the steward of walruses on the occasion of his birth, "is like a salamander eating toasted almonds. One can almost believe in its existence, but one cannot quite visualize it without the accompaniment of appropriate music." Perhaps that is not quite what he said. I may have mixed up the quote with a passage from Eliot's 15 Parsecs from the Delhi. It is of no matter. The spirit expressed is the correct one. All the people in town agree with me, from the street sweeper's assistant to the evil overlord who dwells in yon converted windmill. Now, as I mop up the drool of my predecessor at the table of literary labors, I recall that true itch relief, according to my grandmother, cannot be found in the tacky secretions of the Emger plant, but in the satisfaction of one's inner cravings after the one true God. Talk about the correct expression of spirit. And talk about correction fluid, for that is what we are here for. Of course, one can attempt to provide itch relief by painting correction fluid onto the afflicted area. One of Napoleon's descendants tried it, and look what happened to him. Sometime it truly is best to follow the directions. We all have heard the story that the mother of Mike Nesmith, late of Captain Beefheart's last, sadly undocumented incarnation of the magic band, invented correction fluid. But how many of you have heard the cry of the itchy naked mole rat, feverishly trying to complete his essay on the necessary trade-off between self-awareness and alienation? Oh, how he hates the endless comparisons between his species and social insects. If only they knew how offensive such comparisons were. Perhaps, as suggested in a recent letter, an attempt at listing contrasting qualities and aspects might be a more constructive approach. "My dear Mr. Naked Mole Rat," I replied, "I do not know why you have come to me with this proposal. The logical target of your attentions is the Duc de Dingle, the source of much of my own current discomfort." Mr. Vrontag's spectacular embouchure. "The way he puckers up to the mouthpiece," enthused Roland of the Seven Hills, spiritual successor to Monad the gardener. "It is unique." Brad, who used to run the video rental place next to Mama Cedric's Pizzeria, nodded in agreement. "They call it Vrontag's Kiss." He straightened his tuxedo t-shirt. "He can produce sounds on the trumpet that no one else can." "Excuse me," a small, exquisitely dapper man, quite evidently in his twilight years, turned to Roland and Brad. "But do either of you know if Mr. Vrontag has attempted to use his spectacular embouchure on any instruments other than the trumpet, say the trombone, for instance?" "There are some early recordings on the gluten-free label," Brad began. "With the Dan Dukes Big Band," Roland interposed, "on which Vrontag experimented with the trombone. However, except for his brief flirtation with the tuba in the late 60s, he has devoted himself exclusively to the trumpet." "Ah, I see," said the older man. "Thank you. I just wondered what a man gifted with his extraordinary labia might do with a saxophone." "Completely different approach," Roland sniffed, drawing his upper body back as if easing into a coffin of academia. "With the saxophone, it isn't the lips that are the vital mouth part, but the tongue." Brad tapped his own fleshy, tasting organ. "Indeed," Roland concurred. "Vrontag's equivalent on the saxophone," Brad mused. "Now, who would that be?" Of course, there is no exact equivalent to Vrontag's lips, Roland was quick to point out. Keith Moon's polyphrenic ligaments, Marion Barry's striated nostrils. Brad demanded respect for these examples. What about the excruciating spatulature of Jörg Immendorf? True, but Roland stepped up to Brad's challenge. The older man returned his attention to the empty stage as the two men continued to debate. Back in the dressing room, a nervous Mr. Vrontag sat before the mirror. He delicately stroked an enormous handlebar mustache that nearly obscured his famous mouth. "Do you think they'll accept it?" he asked his manager for the 10th time. Flong sees the valley for the first time. The four men had been selected for their brawn, not their wit. Thus, while each of them handled his share of the weight of Flong's letter with ease, it was up to Dr. Rubens to enhance Flong's enjoyment of the journey with a constant stream of interesting facts and comments about the valley and the surrounding area. "And did you know, Mr. Flong," continued Dr. Rubens, "that Mount Crunch, which we will be able to see on the opposite side of the valley once we reach the overlook, was the site of the Battle of Giffords "No, I didn't," Flong replied wearily. While he reclined on the litter, nursing a sore foot and an injured sense of ostentation, Dr. Rubens walked alongside, taxed hardly at all by his exertions. Damn healthy physician. Meanwhile, the four men carrying Flong to the overlook, where he would see the valley for the first time, kept their minds strictly on their jobs. Small rocks abounded on the slope. To drop Flong would mean more than the promise of a sound beating. Flong was to be the valley's new administrator. The hopes of 100 families rested on him. To incur his wrath would be most unwise. These trees that you now see about you are what the locals call hippo apples. They bear a fruit that Dr. Rubens tried to draw Flong's attention to the flora, but was suddenly interrupted. "Enough!" cried Flong. "I would ride in silence for a while." "Very well," Dr. Rubens replied. They were near the summit anyway. The only sound for the next 5 minutes was that of the bearers grunting and gasping. Then Dr. Rubens quietly spoke. "Careful now," he addressed the men. "We should be just about there." Indeed, only a few paces along they came to the overlook, a gap in the trees at the top of this rather slump-shouldered mountain from which they could look down into the valley. "That's it, Mr. Flong," Dr. Rubens gestured. "Collard Valley." Flong stared for a full minute. Dr. Rubens watched as his eyes, normally so sleepy-looking, raked the landscape from left to the right. "And this whole area is in danger of flooding?" Flong asked. "Yes, Mr. Flong," Dr. Rubens answered, "if the dam isn't stabilized." "Okay," Flong sighed. "I've seen enough. Take me back down." The mustard embargo. Since the full history of the mustard embargo, its social and political ramifications, and the panoply of famous figures at its heart is beyond the scope of this piece, I thought I would instead focus on how the mustard embargo affected one small lower middle-class family living in the port city of Ramshackle. As we join this family, the Eggwoods, in their modest home in the shadow of the Moongatherer's Tower, Mr. Eggwood, a humble banana sorter, has just returned to his house following a routine but tiring shift at the bananerie. "Whose shoes are these?" Milton Eggwood demanded, as he stepped inside the front door and kicked off his own size 13s. "Tina left them there yesterday when she got home from school," Mrs. Eggwood, the former Brenda Flair, answered her husband, cleaning rag, snatched up at the sound of his key in the lock in hand. Milton pondered this for a moment. "Then what does she wear to school today?" he wondered. "She didn't go to school today," Mrs. Eggwood replied. "She's sick." "Sick, eh?" Milton growled. "We'll see about this." He tossed the bag full of old magazines he had salvaged from the trash cans behind the Moongatherer's Tower onto the sofa and went to his daughter's room. He found her lying in bed reading a magazine from an earlier scrounging effort. "So you're sick, huh?" Milton tried to sound stern and doubtful, but the reservoir of his concerns shone through his words like sunlight through closed eyelids. "Yes, Dad," Tina croaked. She had a sore throat and a mild fever. "I brought home some more magazines. You want to go through the bag?" "Sure." Milton retrieved the bag, passed it over to his daughter, kissed her forehead, and went to the kitchen. "What's for supper?" he asked his wife. "I thought we'd have hot dogs," was her reply. "Sounds good," Milton nodded, "but what are we going to put on them?" Mrs. Eggwood frowned thoughtfully and shrugged. "Damn this embargo!" Milton shook his head in despair. Diseased and hidden. When I accepted Bifurcan's offer to include me among the group of graduate students going to Lower Frickensall to investigate the mysterious debris recently found there, I hadn't realized that Bifurcan himself would not be going. "You mean I'm on my own?" I wailed into the phone at the airport just minutes before boarding the plane. On your own, Berfukin replied perplexedly. You're with 13 highly competent young people. Yes, I agreed, young people. I've got nothing in common with them, and they know it. I already overheard one of them mocking my hat. Toads Kabod, Berfukin admonished me as only he can, lading my name with a cargo of expectations it was never intended to bear. Okay, I snapped. The plane's boarding, I've got to go. Later, while my companions chatted amiably, tossing some sort of ball back and forth among themselves and plugging into their various devices for the absorption of discrete portions of their depraved culture, I sat uncomfortably, waiting to be launched into the void. You've flown before, yes? The young woman sitting beside me, a member of the investigating group, asked. Oh, yes, I affirmed heartily. It's just that each time has been my avowed last. After the incident in the Zednot Mountains, I really swore I'd never to fly again. Yet, here I am. What happened in the Zednot Mountains? She asked, wide-eyed and awestruck. I glanced at her as a spy might at a beautiful novice. I'm not permitted to say more, I lied. However, the whole story is in M.H. Haberall's The Man in the Rainwater Barrel, heavily disguised, of course. This last I said knowingly, hinting that a bright young woman like her should be able to read between the lines. To this she readily agreed. Of the subsequent flight in our 3 months in Lower Arkansas, I must necessarily pass quickly over. Let it suffice you to know that the mysterious debris turned out to be ordinary household garbage, and that many people who had hitherto expressed contempt for the old man who accompanied them were forced to revise their opinions after the heavy shit came down.